Greetings, everyone. I embody the eerie. I'm here to assist you today. If this video helps you drift off to sleep, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel before you doze off. What's your location, and what time are you tuning in right now? Take a moment to unwind and enjoy the peace. It was one of those nights when the road stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt vanishing into the shadows, a moment when an unsettling feeling lingered, elusive yet undeniable, as if something was amiss, though the specifics remained just out of reach. For more than 10 years, I've navigated the open roads as a truck driver, transporting a diverse range of goods, from frozen meat to auto parts, all across the nation. While the night shift may not be my top choice, the pay is attractive, and I've come to accept the solitude that comes with it. The engine's hum and the headlights slicing through the darkness have become a part of my routine, yet that night stood out as something truly special. It's a moment etched in my memory, every time I cruise down that stretch of road. After 4 hours on shift in the desolate expanse, with miles of empty highway unfurling ahead, the dashboard clock flickers at 2:47 a.m. My sole companion? The static hum of the radio, a distant echo in the stillness. The road lay in an unusual stillness, devoid of any passing trucks or cars. It was just me, the rumble of my 18-wheeler, and the soft whisper of the wind. The stars appeared to retreat behind a heavy blanket of clouds, leaving only the dim light of my headlights slicing through the night. I took a deep swig from my thermos, wishing the warmth of the coffee would sustain me for a few more hours. That's when I caught sight of her. There she was, poised at the edge of my headlights, a vision in an old white dress that seemed to belong to another era, fluttering gently in the breeze. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands, suggesting she'd been waiting there for quite some time. She remained still, her gaze fixed on me as I drove closer. I eased off the accelerator, straining to catch a clearer glimpse, but an unsettling chill crept through me, cutting through the warmth of the heater. Awakened, every aspect of her felt off, reminiscent of a photograph that has lingered too long in the sunlight, dulled yet undeniably there. I initially considered the possibility that she could be lost or that her car had encountered some trouble nearby. I scanned the shoulder, searching for a vehicle, a hitchhiker's backpack, or anything that could provide a clue. Yet, there was absolutely nothing. There she stood in the shadows, her white dress softly illuminated by the glow of my lights, a vision I couldn't help but capture. I slowed down to a near halt as I glided past her, my gaze locked onto her face, completely oblivious to the truck beside me. I gazed at her, her eyes wide and unblinking. I couldn't quite escape the sensation that I was in a state of anticipation. But for what exactly, All appeared to be perfectly arranged. I called out, my voice trembling with uncertainty, yet there was only silence in response, nothing at all. The only sounds that reached my ears were the gentle rustle of the leaves in the wind and the faint hum of the engine in the distance. For a fleeting instant, I thought about halting, yet an undeniable force, maybe instinct or sheer trepidation, urged me to press on. As I moved forward a few meters, I glanced at the side mirror, my breath caught in my throat. She had vanished, leaving only the empty stretch of road behind me. The scene was desolate, with nothing but my taillights disappearing into the darkness. I narrowed my eyes, certain that fatigue was playing tricks on me, and wondering if I had conjured it all up in my mind. This wasn't the first time I had encountered something unusual on the road after a long stretch of sleepless hours. The lingering sense of unease clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I cranked up the radio, seeking solace in the voices to mask the unsettling images that lingered in my mind. In that moment, the static shattered. A voice emerged, low and crackling, as if battling against a tempest to reach me. You unveiled the truth as well. The words were mere whispers, yet they sliced through the night. I seized the CB radio microphone with precision, striving to maintain a steady tone in my voice. Who am I speaking with? What are you referring to? Yet, silence lingered, interrupted only by the familiar crunch and sporadic bursts of static. My palms were slick against the steering wheel, and my gaze kept drifting to the side mirror, anticipating the moment I would catch a glimpse of her strolling along the roadside. Once again, I was enveloped in darkness, surrounded by emptiness, and engulfed in silence. Yet, just a few moments later, the radio sprang back to life. This time, it was merely casual conversation from another truck driver discussing the snowfall up north. I shook my head, attempting to dispel the persistent sense of unease. Perhaps it was merely a playful prank under the cover of night, a local enjoying a laugh at the expense of passing drivers. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory of how their eyes appeared to cut through the darkness, as if they were peering directly into my soul. I continued to drive, striving to concentrate on the road ahead, yet the lingering chill from earlier persisted. A thick fog crept in around the truck, enveloping the distant trees and obscuring the yellow lines of the road. It was as if I was navigating through a surreal dreamscape, everything around me distorted and hazy, accompanied by the soothing hum of the engine. It was the sole anchor in my reality, yet even that felt like a dream. As I lifted my thermos for another sip, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the fog, something pale and ethereal, hovering just off the shoulder of the road. As I struggled to catch my breath, she appeared before me, the same woman in the white dress. This time, her face was nearer. It was more visible, sharper, almost too sharp, as if she were standing just inches away from me, despite the several meters that separated us. I made a quick, sharp maneuver, dodging beside the figure. The trailer rocked uncontrollably. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through me as I struggled to grasp the chaos that had just unfolded. I glanced at the side mirror, but she was gone once more, vanishing into the fog as if she had never existed. At that moment, the radio came to life with a crackle. "Keep your voice alive." This moment felt critical, teetering on the edge of desperation. Though I didn't recognize her, the way she spoke compelled me to clutch the steering wheel with increasing intensity, my knuckles paling to a stark white. "Who on earth are you?" I inquired, yet the radio fell silent once more, leaving behind only the faint buzz of static. What began as a straightforward road trip quickly transformed into an unforgettable journey, featuring 3 lifelong friends, a handful of days away from the daily grind, and the exhilarating promise of adventure along the open road. Our planned route was meticulously mapped out. We mapped out delightful stops at charming roadside diners and intriguing attractions. We eagerly anticipated a weekend brimming with joy and liberation. Yet, the journey has a peculiar knack for testing you, particularly when you wander too far from the familiar route. Amidst the endless expanse of trees and the dwindling signals from our phones, we made a wrong turn that altered the course of our journey forever. After hours on the road, we watched as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in vibrant shades of fiery orange. As the GPS proposed a shortcut, a meandering path through a thick forest, we were weary, and the thought of trimming an hour or two off our journey felt just right. A small village appeared on the map across the way, presenting an enticingly easy detour. We hit the road, playfully speculating that we might stumble upon a hidden gem of a restaurant or an unusual attraction to share later on. The journey began on a beautifully paved road, gliding effortlessly beneath the towering pines that danced gently in the afternoon breeze. As we continued on our journey, the pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, while the trees gradually encroached, casting deeper shadows around us. Even as twilight descended and the GPS faltered, we held onto our optimism, confident that we would either find our way to the village or make our way back to the main road. After all, how lost could we truly be? As another hour slipped by, the dirt road unfurled before us, winding endlessly through the heart of the forest. As I navigated through the forest, I noticed the gas gauge dipping lower than I preferred. A flicker of unease washed over me, yet I made an effort to maintain my composure. We continued to laugh, attempting to lighten the mood, yet beneath the surface, we all sensed it, the unsettling realization that we had crossed a line, that something about this journey felt off. The true trouble began when the car sputtered to a halt, a sharp gasp, a tremor from the engine, and then silence fell. We paused on the rugged dirt road, the headlights illuminating the surroundings and creating elongated shadows among the brush. "It has to be the battery," Tom muttered, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. He lifted the hood and started inspecting the engine, while Emily searched for a signal on her phone, raising it toward the windshield. I stepped out of the car, hoping the cool night air would offer some relief, but the breeze felt oddly present. The air was uncharacteristically cold, enveloped in an eerie stillness. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that sent shivers down my spine. I approached the car, its headlights struggling to cut through the thick veil of darkness. With a frustrated murmur, Tom slammed the hood shut. He insisted it wasn't the battery. "So, what's our next move, Emily?" Tom ran his fingers through his hair, lost in thought. "Let's retrace our steps. Perhaps we'll come across a sign or a house, something like this." We grabbed the flashlights from the trunk and made our way back, leaving the car behind us. Initially, we attempted to maintain the conversation, cracking jokes about how we would recount this tale in the future. However, the laughter gradually faded, and the silence enveloping the forest became oppressive. Each snap of a branch beneath our feet sent shivers down our spines. After roughly 20 minutes of walking, I noticed something unusual. The path we were supposed to follow, it felt like I had encountered a landmark, yet everything appeared identical. The same trees, the same curves, trapped in an endless loop. Tom observed the same detail, shifting his flashlight to the edges of the road in search of something recognizable, yet all he encountered were more trees. "This is confusing." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, sensing that someone was watching us. I was ready to crack a joke, but the words just vanished before they could escape my lips. As I experienced it as well, that peculiar pressure at the nape of my neck, that unsettling sensation of being observed from the shadows, we continued our journey. Yet, the path appeared to stretch endlessly, the darkness thickening, the air growing chillier. Then, I noticed the lights, faint and flickering through the trees. They weren't lighthouses or street lamps. They were softer, reminiscent of a candle's glow. Campfire or lantern relief washed over me as we instinctively veered off the path, drawn toward the mysterious light. The branches creaked beneath our feet, and shadows flickered in the dim glow. When we finally emerged into a clearing, we halted in disbelief. It wasn't a house or a campfire. It was a rusty lantern dangling from a crooked branch, casting an eerie illumination. Below it, fresh tire tracks marred the earth, unmistakably matching those of our car. A chill raced down my spine, and Emily's voice trembled as she whispered, "Who would put this here?" Tom instinctively took a step back. We need to head back to the car now, but as we turned to retrace our steps, the trail had vanished, and the trees had enveloped the clearing, as if a road had never existed at all. Initially, my heart raced as we illuminated the surroundings with our lanterns, revealing nothing but endless forest and creeping shadows. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I spotted 3 tall figures, standing still and observing us from the darkness, having concealed themselves expertly. Always lurking just beyond the light, Tom gripped my arm tightly as we sprinted away. It didn't matter where we were headed. We just needed to escape those shadowy figures. The branches clawed at our skin, and the darkness felt like it was closing in around us. Yet, against all odds, we rediscovered our path. The outline of our car emerged in the distance, prompting us to sprint with urgency. But as we approached, a sense of dread washed over us. The driver's door stood ajar, and I was convinced, without a doubt, that we had secured it. We rushed to the vehicle, and with trembling hands, Tom turned the key. The engine sprang to life, and then Emily, her voice cracking, spoke up. He leaned in closer and whispered, "They're still watching us." I kept my eyes on the road ahead, determined to leave that place behind me as swiftly as I could. As the glow of a gas station appeared on the horizon, a wave of relief washed over us, as if we could finally take a deep breath once more. We paused beneath the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights, the engine humming softly. Silence enveloped us for what felt like an eternity, as the weight of the truth settled in. We sensed a presence in that forest, and the most unsettling part was the realization that whatever lurked there had chosen to spare us this time. The quaint cottage stood at the village's edge, where the glow of streetlights dwindled into vast open fields, and the air turned colder and crisper. This cherished item has been passed down through my family for generations. Even though the house had stood empty for years, ever since my uncle vanished and left it to my father, I never imagined I would actually visit. However, after inheriting it following my father's passing, I resolved to spend a weekend exploring the property. My expectations were low, perhaps just a bit of dust and some creaky floorboards. However, the instant I stepped inside, an unsettling feeling washed over me, signaling that something was amiss. The atmosphere within was heavy, saturated with the scent of aged timber and decay. I left the front door ajar, inviting a touch of afternoon light to filter through the dust, dancing in the hallway. Everything was just as I recalled from my childhood visits. The tattered wallpaper, the sagging floors, and that creaky railing my cousins and I would slide down when we believed the adults weren't watching. Yet now, the atmosphere had shifted. It was akin to stepping into a recollection warped into something more sinister. I moved through the rooms, assessing what repairs were necessary. The living room windows were stuck, with cobwebs draping the corners like delicate, vintage lace. The kitchen was cloaked in a thick layer of dirt, obscuring the old oak cabinets that lay beneath. As I navigated through the house, my footsteps resonated with a hollow sound, the floorboards creaking beneath me as if urging me to turn back, yet there was an undeniable presence lingering in the air. A soft sound, a delicate whisper, drifted from the far end of the hallway where the basement door stood. That door appeared just as I recalled, coated in a muted gray and secured with a weathered padlock. Suspended from a chain, the padlock had finally vanished. The chain dangled carelessly from the doorknob, sending a chill racing down my spine, yet I simply shrugged it off. Drafty old houses and rusted padlocks might seem intimidating, yet my curiosity ultimately triumphed over any fear. I opened the door to unveil a narrow wooden staircase that spiraled down into the shadows. The air that wafted out the air was piercingly cold, untouched and frozen in time. I flipped the switch at the top of the stairs, but nothing exciting occurred. I considered, there's no power down there. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and carefully descended a creaky step to the basement, chilled to an even more biting temperature than the rest of the house, the air thick with dampness and a subtle hint of mold lingering in the atmosphere. I guided the light along the walls adorned with aged wooden shelves, brimming with jars, tools, and an array of gadgets meticulously gathered by my uncle over the years. Suddenly, my flashlight illuminated an unexpected sight in the background. A small door, previously overlooked, partially concealed behind a stack of dusty boxes. The object, crafted from wood, featured a bronze handle that shimmered under the flashlight's beam, standing out as almost pristine amidst the surrounding decay. I gave the knob a twist, and it turned effortlessly. As I crossed the threshold, I found myself in a room devoid of windows, its concrete walls enclosing a stark atmosphere. A solitary light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting an unsteady glow that flickered to life as I entered. The walls brimmed with shelves, yet instead of tools, they displayed an array of old photographs, each telling a story of its own. Initially, I perceived them as mere instant black and white family snapshots of distant relatives, grinning at picnics and striking poses in front of the house during its prime. As I swept the flashlight across the shelves, an icy shiver coursed through me. The collection included not only vintage images but also recent snapshots of my father, my uncle, and myself. A portrait captured me standing outside the house. On that very day, as I stood outside the house, my hands started to quiver, making the flashlight shake in unison with my nerves. I took a step back, my thoughts swirling in a frenzy. Who might have captured those images? No one had any idea I was on my way here. I had made the decision to come just the night before. As I reached for M on the shelf, my fingers quivered with anticipation. The light bulb flickered once more, casting the room into shadows. For a fleeting instant, The light flickered back to life, only to vanish just as suddenly. The breath lingers like a whisper in the air. He shifted in the corner of the room, something small darting just out of my view. I quickly swung the flashlight around, my heart pounding in my ears, but the beam only revealed empty walls and vacant corners. I reassured myself it was just my imagination, that the dim light was deceiving my eyes. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, as if someone was shifting their weight from one foot to another behind me. I turned the flashlight again, sweeping over the shelves, but the room remained empty, just as it had been. The only sound was my own rapid, breathless gasps in the confined space. I took another step back, my heel catching on the doorway, nearly causing me to fall. My hands gripped the doorknob tightly, and I slammed it shut behind me. For a moment, I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to steady myself. As I focused on my breathing, my thoughts replayed the unsettling scene I had just witnessed in that room. The haunting images, the shadow that appeared to shift with the flickering light, it all felt utterly incomprehensible. Perhaps it was just a jest, the village kids teasing me, yet that reasoning felt too convenient, too straightforward. I dashed up the stairs, shutting the basement door with a sense of urgency, as if that slender chain could truly hold back whatever lurked beyond. As I stood there, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows that danced across the living room. The idea of spending the night alone in this house sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my keys from the counter, but just as I reached for the front door, a sound pierced the silence, a low screech emanating from the basement, as if someone or something was making its way up the stairs. I turned slowly. With my flashlight clutched tightly and my heart racing, I stood before the closed basement door. The chain dangled loosely, yet the sound echoed once more, a creak. Unmistakably a footstep, just beyond the threshold. Driving alone on the back roads in the dead of night evokes an unsettling feeling, as the trees loom on either side, closing in, while your headlights slice through the darkness. The darkness has always captivated me, offering a serene escape into solitude, a moment where I felt like the sole inhabitant of the world. Yet, there are certain locations where the silence feels unsettling, where shadows shift unnaturally and the atmosphere thickens with an eerie tension that sends chills down your spine. That's precisely how it felt the night I discovered the old motel, the one that never should have existed, had always been there. After hours of cruising along the highway and opting for a shortcut through a maze of winding country roads, my GPS lost signal about 30 minutes ago. However, I remained unfazed. I had a solid grasp of the general direction I needed to head in, and I was confident I would reconnect with the main highway soon enough. As the clock struck 2 a.m., a wave of fatigue washed over me, making my eyes wander. My thoughts drifted like grains of sand, and the notion of pausing for a few hours of sleep grew increasingly enticing. In that moment, my eyes caught a glimpse of it, a subtle neon glow cutting through the trees, boldly illuminating the word motel in vibrant hues of pink and blue. I can't recall spotting it on the map, but hey, who am I to question my good fortune? I reassured myself that it was a surprising gift. I turned and rolled into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching over the loose stones beneath me. The establishment appeared untouched by time, with peeling paint on the sign and a flickering "no vacancies" light casting an eerie glow. Despite the parking lot's emptiness, the building stood as a single-story structure, featuring a series of rooms with doors that opened directly onto the lot. Each room was painted a different color, though the hues had faded with time. Some windows displayed broken blinds, and the distant hum of a vending machine near the office filled the air. Yet, in that moment, I was too weary to concern myself with appearances. All I craved was a bed and some rest. After a few hours of restless sleep, I parked the car and made my way to the reception area. It was a small room, dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light, filled with a musty scent of old carpet and stale smoke. I rang the bell at the counter, and after a brief pause, an older man shuffled out from the back. He had a thin frame and sunken eyes that seemed to bore into me. His badge read, "Carl. You need a room," he said in a gruff voice. It had been ages since I'd spoken to anyone, so I nodded and forced a smile. He didn't ask for identification. Instead, he slid a key across the counter, attached to one of those old plastic plates marked with room number 7. I handed him a couple of bills without waiting for change, and he regarded me with a lingering look before retreating into the dim light of the office. I found room 7 in the middle of the hallway, and the door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting. I had to use my shoulder to get it fully ajar. Inside was exactly what I expected: a cheap bedspread adorned with flowers, a bedside table with a sticky lamp, and an old TV with a cracked screen. The carpet was stained, and the air was thick with a musty odor. I closed the door behind me, tossed my bag onto the bed, and sank onto the worn mattress with a sigh. I chose not to switch on the light. Instead, I slipped off my boots and reclined, allowing the darkness to wrap around me. Though it wasn't the most comfortable situation, it would suffice for a few hours. However, the moment he closed his eyes, a faint tapping sound emerged from the wall behind me. I froze, my eyes snapping open, straining to catch the sound of a quickening heartbeat. My own heart beat rhythmically, steady, as if someone were knocking softly just a few feet away. I turned to the wall, hoping to hear laughter or whispers, thinking it might be a guest playing a prank, but there was nothing, just the persistent tapping, measured like a heartbeat, echoing through the thin walls. I sat there, listening intently, as the sound seemed to glide along the wall, approaching and then retreating. My pulse quickened, and without a second thought, I reached for the lamp on the bedside table and flicked it on. The bulb flickered a couple of times before casting a sickly yellow glow. The tapping ceased, and silence enveloped me, thick and suffocating, making the air feel heavier. I stared at the wall, hoping to see something, but it was just that, an old, stained wall, like those found in any seedy motel around the world. I chuckled uneasily, attempting to ease the tension. I convinced myself it was merely the pipes or perhaps a rat scurrying within the walls, yet beneath the surface, an unsettling sense lingered that something was amiss. I settled back down, but the moment I switched off the light, the pounding resumed, now louder and more demanding than before. A chill coursed through me, prompting me to sit up once more. With my heart pounding in my chest, I glanced at the door, considering the idea of packing my things and getting out of there, but tiredness kept me anchored in bed. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing, and tried to ignore it, but then I heard it, a voice, a barely audible whisper slipping through the cracks of the window. It was too low to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a desperate pleading. My skin bristled and I stood up, slowly approaching the window covered by thin yellow curtains. I hesitated with my hands suspended over the cloth, and then, in an act of irrational bravery, I slammed them open. The parking lot was empty, illuminated by the flickering of the neon sign. The light cast shadows on the gravel, but just as I was about to letting go of the curtains and turning around, I saw something moving at the edge of the parking lot where darkness swallowed the light. He was a small, hunched figure walking back and forth along the tree line. Shadows seemed to cling to his body, obscuring his features, but I could see his head jerking back and forth as if searching for something. My mouth went dry and I took a step back, letting the curtain fall again. The tapping on the wall intensified, almost frantic, and now the voice was clearer, a single word repeated over and over again. "Please, please." I stumbled backwards towards the bed, clutching my bag with trembling hands. I didn't care how tired I was anymore. I needed to get out of there, but just as I reached the door, the knob started to jerk. The sound echoed in the room, loud and metallic. Someone or something was trying to open it from outside. I held my breath, slowly backing up, my eyes fixed on the door, which trembled with each shake. The voice outside became louder, more urgent, and now I could clearly hear what it was saying. "Let me in, please. Let me in." I threw myself towards the window, yanked open it, and slid me slipping on the loose stones, and practically I threw myself into the driver's seat with trembling fingers. I reached for the keys, but before I started the engine I looked into the room. The door to the room was wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges, but there was no one inside, only long shadows on the old carpet piling up in the corners as if they had a life of their own. The engine roared when I turned the key and stepped on the accelerator fully. The gravel flew behind me as I shot out of the parking lot, not behind. Not even when I thought I saw a movement in the somewhat pale rear view mirror and Delgado slipping between the rows of rooms. I didn't stop until the neon lights disappeared into the distance and the road ended the night. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I finally braked with my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I sat in the parking lot of a diner staring out there trying to convince that it had just been a bad night, that the motel was abandoned, that the noises were my imagination. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I would almost swear I saw the door to room 7 hanging open and a shadow moving inside it. Sometimes in the quietest hours of the night I still hear that soft, desperate voice slipping through the shadows. "Let me in, please let me in." There's a strange sense of peace in being the only person awake on a cruise ship in the middle of the night, when everyone else is asleep. The ship looks like a ghost town, empty corridors, the soft creak of the hull, the low hum of the engines vibrating across the deck. I've always been a night bird, and on this trip I found myself wandering around the ship a lot after the bars closed, enjoying the loneliness. But one night that loneliness felt different, as if I wasn't alone at all. It all started around 2 in the morning on one of the observation decks looking out over the black and endless ocean. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, turning the sea into an undulating abyss. The lights of the ship barely cut through the mist that hung over the waves. The deck was deserted as it is every night before. No one else in the cold, salty air. But that night something changed. First it was a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere below. It was subtle, as if someone was knocking softly on a door. The echo was traveling through the metal of the ship. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it must be the ship settling or some crew member moving cargo. The relentless pounding echoed around me, growing louder and more urgent, as if beckoning something from the depths. I leaned over the railing, straining to catch a glimpse of its source, but only shadows greeted me. The dark silhouette of the ship, the misty water swirling below. The sound morphed into a peculiar rhythm, a coded message that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I turned toward the inner corridors, intent on retreating to my cabin and shaking off the restlessness that clung to me. Yet, as I stepped inside, an unsettling sight met my eyes. The hallway lights flickered erratically, not the usual sputter of a faulty bulb, but a chaotic flash, as if something unseen was tampering with the fragile electricity. I glanced back at the deserted deck. Nothing but the night and the distant roar of the waves. I shook my head, dismissing my own unease, and continued forward. But with each step, the lights pulsed faster, as if they were responding to my very presence in the midnight gloom. As I navigated the corridor, the ship made a turn, and there she was, a silhouette at the far end, shrouded in the flickering glow of the dim light. With her back turned to me, her long hair cascaded over her shoulders, arms resting at her sides, she donned a dress of muted white, reminiscent of a bygone era. The fabric appeared to sway gently. Even with the air in the corridor remaining motionless, I came to a sudden halt. Another passenger breathed shallow, but something wasn't right. She wasn't moving. She didn't even seem to notice my presence. She just swayed almost imperceptibly, as if she heard something far, far away. A primal instinct screamed at me not to get close, but I couldn't stand there. I took a deep breath and I took a step forward. "Okay." My voice sounded too loud in the silence. She didn't respond. She didn't turn her head. She didn't even flinch. The lights flicker more strongly, casting shadows. On the wall behind it, shadows that moved, but not according to the light. A shiver ran down my spine. Then the pounding came back harder, closer. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the ground beneath me. My heart raced, and just as I was about to turn and run, the woman moved slowly, too slowly, like a rag doll being lifted by invisible threads. Her head turned first, but her body remained still. Her hair fell to the side, and I saw his empty face, sunken, lips moving, forming. Silent words, a whisper that didn't reach my ears. I didn't wait to listen. I turned around and ran down the corridor. It seemed to lengthen before me. The lights were flickering faster and faster. The tapping increased, as if something was going up the hull of the ship, something that wanted to come out. When I got to my cabin, my hands were shaking, so much so that I could barely put the card in the lock. 3 tries, 4. Finally the door opened. I threw myself inside and slammed it with my back against the wood. Silence. My breathing. It was the only thing I could hear. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined everything, that tiredness and sleepless hours were affecting me. But when I turned to secure the door, I saw it there, right inside my room on the floor, a small wet footprint too much painted to be mine. My throat closed, my eyes swept around the room, but there was no one there, just my things as I had left them. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to sleep. I spent the night looking at the door, waiting. I heard the knocking again, but it didn't come back the next morning. I tried to ask a crew member about what I had seen. A bartender, a middle-aged man, with a tired expression, shrugged. "Ships make strange noises," he said, cleaning a glass nonchalantly, "and sometimes people see things that aren't there." But he didn't look me in the eye when he said it. I avoided the empty corridors. The rest of the trip I stayed in the common areas, where I could hear the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. But every time I passed by an eye was curing or looking out at the empty sea. I was hoping to see her again, waiting, watching. The last night, as I lay in my bunk with my eyes open, I heard something, a faint sound far away, a tapping as if it came from the depths of the ship or from something deeper, something that never came down with the ship, something that never left. There is a strange silence that settles over the forest when you are miles away from any village, of any road, of any sign of other people. Is the kind of stillness that makes you hear things you'd normally ignore, even the mountains. Looking for a weekend of peace, of solitude, away from the noise of the city, we found a place miles from the nearest trail, a site so remote that we felt like we had discovered our own world. But now I think there are places that are meant to remain untouched. We reached the top of the ridge, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the valley below. It was beautiful, an endless horizon of forest, the air cool and clean, the sky turning from an orange hue to a deep blue covered in stars. We set up camp near the edge of the ridge, so we could see the stars. Dave lit a fire, and we spent the night chatting about everything and nothing, letting the flames warm our hands as the temperature dropped. By the time we got into the tent, the night was black as La Brea, the only light coming from the twinkling embers of the fire. We left the tent flaps open, allowing fresh air to enter. The silence out there felt different, sharper somehow. It wasn't long before Dave's breathing turned uniform, falling asleep, but I stayed awake, listening to the stillness take over the forest, my thoughts wandering in the dark. It was then that I heard the first sound, a distant rustle of dry leaves, as if someone was walking through the undergrowth. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound didn't repeat, and I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, moving through the trees. I closed eyes, trying to relax, but my mind kept repeating that noise over and over again. At some point I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up with the feeling that someone was watching me. I slammed my eyes open and looked through the open entrance of the store, expecting to see someone standing in the dark. But there was nothing, just the faint glow of the dying fire casting shadows on the ground. I turned around, trying to shake off the sensation, but then I heard it again, this time much closer, a crack, then another, slow and deliberate, like footsteps approaching the store. I froze, my pulse speeding up. I reached out and pushed Dave to wake him up. He stirred, muttering something under his breath, but the noise outside continued. Soft, careful, moving in a slow circle around the store. Dave sat up, rubbing his eyes, but his expression he changed when he noticed my panicked face. I put a finger on my lips, pointing towards the entrance. His expression tightened. He understood that he wasn't joking. We stood there in silence, listening as the footsteps circled the store again. Slow, steady. Dave reached for his flashlight and with a slight shake of his head turned it on, pointing the light towards the entrance. The ace of light pierced through the darkness, illuminating the trees beyond the clearing. But we didn't see anything. "It's probably just an animal," Dave whispered. Despite the uncertainty in his voice, I nodded, determined not to appear paranoid. We lingered for a few more minutes, but the sound had faded, leaving the forest enveloped in silence. Eventually, we settled down, though sleep eluded us. The next morning, we awoke to find the fire extinguished and the morning fog clinging to the trees. We chuckled about the previous night, convincing him it was merely a deer or raccoon that had ventured too close to our campsite. Yet, as we packed for our hike, an unsettling feeling lingered. Something seemed to be watching us from the shadows. Our day unfolded with exploration, hiking through valleys and scaling ridges, with mountains sprawling in every direction. However, as the day wore on, I started to pick up on little inconspicuous clues that something was missing. Well, broken branches high up in the trees, like something tall had passed through their stones arranged in odd patterns near the creek, like they'd been placed on purpose. When I pointed it out to Dave, he just shrugged his shoulders. Probably old trail marks, he said, or kids playing, but deep down he knew there was no way anyone else had been here recently. This place was too remote, too intact. That uneasiness I had felt the night before only intensified, becoming a weight on my chest. We returned to camp as the sun sank deeper under the shadows, lengthening, swallowing the trail behind us. By the time we reached the ridge, the air had become icy and the forest around was quickly darkening. Steve reignited the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. As if the trees leaned a little closer, as if they were listening. That night we kept the fire burning longer. We sat by the flames as the darkness thickened around us. Dave tried to joke about it by telling stories of Bigfoot and forest creatures, but neither of us laughed. Finally the conversation died and we stood in silence listening to the crackle of the fire, and then, just as the flames began to grow, as we prepared to venture out, the familiar sound returned. The slow, deliberate crack of footsteps weaving through the trees. Dave and I exchanged glances, and this time, I could see the fear etched in his eyes. He reached for the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I gripped his arm, shaking my head. I didn't whisper a word. We stayed there, barely breathing, as the footsteps drew nearer. They halted just beyond the flickering glow of the fire. I strained my eyes to discern something in the shadows and caught a fleeting glimpse of a pale shape gliding through the trees, but when I blinked, it vanished. The footsteps resumed, circling the clearing as if probing our limits, testing how far they could go before we reacted. A chill ran down my spine, a certainty that whatever lurked out there was toying with us. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded, fading into the depths of the woods, leaving us enveloped in silence. Dave exhaled a shaky breath, and I realized my hands were trembling. We remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavily between us. As we nestled into the tent, flashlight in hand, sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, fixated on the shifting shadows dancing across the tent walls, listening intently, waiting, and pondering whether whatever lurked outside would return. I always believed I could conquer my fear of driving at night. After years of late-night journeys, you learn to tune out the endless stretches of empty asphalt, the shadows that dance beneath your headlights, and the eerie sensation that the world has vanished, leaving only the steady hum of the engine. But then came that fateful night, the night I picked up a hitchhiker. A boy stood alone in the darkness, his hand raised by the roadside. I still can't explain why I stopped. It was well past midnight, and I was on a secluded road winding through miles of dense forest, one of those places where cell phone signals fade into oblivion. I had been driving for hours, battling drowsiness, when I first spotted him, a dark silhouette caught in the glow of my headlights as they swept across the shoulder. He looked young. No older than 18 or 19, Delgado stood there in an oversized jacket, a thumb raised in approval, his face partially obscured by the hood. Typically, I steer clear of picking up hitchhikers, especially not at that hour, especially not in the middle of nowhere, but there was something about the way I was standing completely alone that made me hesitate. He seemed to be freezing, his shoulders hunched against the cold, and for an instant I saw myself reflected in him at that age, lost, trying to find my way, hoping for a little kindness before I could think too much about it. He was already hitting the brakes, listening to the crunch of the gravel under the tires. He walked towards the car, moving awkwardly as if it hurt. When he reached the window, he lowered his hood, revealing a pale face and Delgado with sunken eyes that looked too old for someone so young. I forced a grinning, trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort that was beginning to grow in my chest. "Where are you going?" He hesitated for a moment, and then smiled slightly, almost shyly. "Either way, I need a ride." It wasn't the answer I wanted to hear, but I nodded, and unraveled the door. He climbed in, and suddenly the cab of the truck seemed smaller, the colder air clinging to a worn-out backpack against his chest, his fingers tightening the frayed straps. He almost didn't look at me as he settled into the seat. We handled silently for a while, the headlights carving a narrow path of light through the darkness. I tried to make conversation with him, but his answers were short, curt, as if he didn't want to give too much information. when I asked him where he came from. He just shrugged. It doesn't matter. When I asked him where he was going, he muttered alone, far away. The discomfort in my chest he got bigger with every mile. Maybe he'd had a rough patch. Maybe he was just having one of those nights where all you want is to keep moving forward, get away from all of that. He understood, but there was something about him that something was wrong. Like the way he constantly looked over his shoulder like he expected to see something there, or the way he tensed up every time. Every time the headlights illuminated a new bend in the road, after about 20 minutes, the silence between us became unbearable, so I tried again. "You're from around here?" He didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking out the window, then finally turned his head towards me. His face looked even paler under the dim light of the dashboard. "Have you ever seen something you can't explain?" A chill ran through my back. I forced a laugh. "I've seen a lot of weird things on the road, comes with the job." But he didn't smile. He just nodded as if he expected me to say that. Then he looked out the window again. "Sometimes there's things out there, whispered things, they don't like to be seen." I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed the steering wheel, staring at the road for a moment. I wanted to stop telling him to get off, but another part of me, the part that has always been too curious for its own good, forced me to keep driving. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had spent too much time alone in the dark. We went on like this for several miles more, the air between us dense with unspoken words. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of him in the side mirror, a shadow that felt out of place. It was faint, almost lost in the darkness of the forest, yet it appeared to shift, to sprint away. I kicked off the beat with the truck. With my heart pounding, I slammed down on the accelerator. The engine unleashed a powerful roar as the truck accelerated with impressive speed. "What on earth is that?" you murmured, stiffening your knuckles. They turned white when you grabbed the seat. "You saw it. Did you see it? Did you whisper the one who has been following us?" Since I left, I looked at him out of the corner of my eye, my mouth dry. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was closer, stuck to the back of the truck, had no definite shape. It wasn't an animal or a man, just a blur of darkness like an ink blot against the night for the truck. His sharp voice suddenly said, "You have to let me down." Now I shook my head, the adrenaline pumping in my veins. "I'm not going to leave you here in the middle of nowhere. What's going on?" But he just shook his head, his huge eyes and full of terror. "It's not you he wants." "What is it to me?" An icy chill ran through my body. "And if I stay in this truck," he looked at me, "his face will come for both of them." My stomach sank. Something in his voice made me so. Without thinking about it anymore, I stepped on the brake. The truck skidded on the gravel when we stopped on the shoulder. He almost fell when he opened the door. Suddenly he staggered a few steps, panting, clutching his backpack as if it were the only thing keeping him in this world. He looked over his shoulder, waiting, then turned to me. "Go away." But now the air changed, became heavier, colder. The forest seemed to move, the shadows in the trees, twisted at impossible angles, faceless, only a pair of pale, empty eyes fixed on the boy. And then, on a single blink of an eye, my body panicked, stepped on the gas, shot out of there, the image of his face still etched in my mind. In the mirror I saw his silhouette shrinking in the distance. And then, as if he had never been there, he vanished. You never realize how much the forest changes after dark, until you get lost in it. He had been walking all day, following a path that meandered through a dense forest. It was supposed to be a quick and easy trip, something to clear my mind after a stressful week, but I underestimated how fast the sun was going down. By the time I realized I had strayed off the path, the last light of the day had already bled to death on the horizon. I should have returned sooner. I should have paid more attention to the twists and turns of the trail. But when the panic set in, it took hold of me. It was too late. The forest became a maze of shadows and rustling leaves. Each tree looked the same as the last. I tried to use my phone to check a map, but only the hateful message of no service appeared. Like a blow in the stomach, my flashlight was my only ally, a thin ray of light in the darkness. But with each passing minute it seemed to shrink as if the night were devouring its brightness. I tried to retrace my steps, but each direction took me farther into the forest. Soon I couldn't even hear the stream I'd been following, and then I heard it, a low, melodic hum. I stopped in dry, holding my breath, straining to hear better. It was faint, floating among the trees like smoke without a direction. Clara, but it was there. My first thought was that it must be another hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. The thought filled me with relief. "Hello, there's someone there," I shouted, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. The buzzing stopped and the heavy stillness that followed was even worse. I waited with the flashlight shaking in my hand. There was no response. After a few seconds the sound came back, but this time it was softer, as if the one who produced it was trying to attract me. Every instinct in my body shouted at me that I walked away, turned around and ran, but the thought of spending the whole night alone in the woods not knowing where I was too scary, so against my better judgment I followed the sound, hoping it would take me to a campfire, to a person who could help me find my way back. I kept walking for what seemed like an eternity. The trees closed around me, their branches forming a roof that blocked out even the faintest starlight. The hum grew in intensity, clearer and clearer, but it never really came close. It always stood just outside the light of my flashlight, always a step away. And then I saw it through the gaps between the trees. A light flickered, a golden glow that cut through the darkness like a lighthouse. My heart skipped a beat of hope, and I quickened my pace, stumbling over roots and rocks in my haste. When the trees finally opened, they saw the source of the light was a cabin, an old structure, its wooden walls warped by time. The roof seemed to be about to collapse. The windows were covered in grime, but inside there was light, the light of a fire burning, and just beyond the cabin, on the edge from the clearing, there was a tall, thin figure dressed in a long, ragged dress that fluttered in the breeze. Her face was hidden by a veil of dark hair. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly to one side as if she heard something that only she could hear, and from her lips emanated that same low, melancholy hum, the sound that had guided me here. My feet froze on the ground, my breath, something stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She didn't seem quite human. She didn't seem to belong to this time. But before I could move, she stopped humming and whispered, "You've come from far away." Her voice was a soft whisper, but it echoed in the night with an impossible clarity. "You're lost." I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "Yes," I replied with the trembling voice. I deviated. The biggest and oldest Gonzalez, lurking in the darkness, finally spoke again, slurring the words as if he were testing them on his tongue. "Come out," he repeated, almost like in a dream. "There's no way out." Only through. My stomach sank through what I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The figure smiled. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I felt it. I knew it was a smile that didn't contain joy, just something patient, like I already knew the end of this story. Through the trees whispered through the shadows, "But if you want, you can stay here. It's safer." Every cell in my body screamed at me to walk away, to turn around and run, but my legs didn't respond. I looked at the cabin, the dim light dancing in the windows as if calling me. Something inside me wanted to come in. I wanted to cross that threshold and let the fire engulf me. I couldn't stay. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to take a step back away from the figure. "I think I'll keep going," I said, trying to make my voice sound firm, but it was barely a whisper. She gave her head one last time. "You don't have to be afraid," she murmured. "It's not me you should fear." An icy chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" But before I could get an answer, the figure disappeared. Flickering 1 second it was there, and the next it had vanished into the night. The fire inside the cabin also went out. Total darkness. The only light left was that of mill internal, trembling in my hand. And then I heard a sound behind me, a rustling in the undergrowth. I turned suddenly, directing the flashlight towards the forest. Nothing. But the air felt colder, denser, and suddenly I knew. No, I was alone. Something else. I was there. Something hidden among the trees, waiting. Fear hit me hard, and without thinking about it anymore, I turned on my heels and ran away. The trees seemed to narrow around me as I ran, the shadows lengthening as if trying to catch me. My footsteps echoed with a desperate urgency, and behind me, in the breeze, I heard the echo of a soft laugh, or maybe a murmur, but I didn't look back. I ran until my legs burned, until the forest began to clear and a faint blue glow began to dye the sky. The dawn of some era had found its way back. When it finally emerged, it was still there, lonely in the deserted parking lot. I threw myself inside and locked the door. I didn't stop, I didn't rest. I drove until I saw the lights of the city, until the first rays of sunlight dispelled the darkness. I didn't look back. I don't know what that cabin was. I don't know what it was. But since that night I haven't hiked alone, and sometimes when the wind blows through the trees outside my window, I think I hear it again, that soft murmur, that wordless song, and I wonder if the cabin is still there, if it's waiting for the next traveler to get lost in the woods, waiting to someone who doesn't find their way back. There's something unsettling about the fog when you're in the water at night. It glides slowly wrapping the world around you in a maze of shadows and blurred silhouettes where even the familiar becomes strange. Like that, it felt the night I got lost in the bay alone in my fishing boat. The fog was so thick that it swallowed the stars and turned the surface of the water in a dark mirror. I grew up on the shore. I thought I knew every channel, every inlet like the back of my hand. But that night it was as if the ocean had changed its mind about letting me find my way back. I had been fishing longer than I should have, chasing one last catch as the sun disappeared into the horizon. By the time I realized how dark the fog was, I had slid over the water, turning the shoreline into a blurry spot in the distance. I didn't worry too much at first. I thought I just had to follow the harbor lights, but the more I sailed, the denser the fog became until it swallowed the whole world. I slowed down, letting the water gently lick against the hull, trying to orient me. The air was cold and wet, seeping into my bones, and it made every sound feel too close. I hoped to hear the distant hum of other boats, the echo of a fog voice, something. But there was nothing, just the gentle pounding of the waves against the boat and the murmur of the breeze gliding over the water. I turned off the engine, thinking that without the noise of the engine I could hear better. The silence closed around me, heavy, oppressive, and then I saw it, a dim light flickering in the distance like a lantern. Floating on the waves, relief flooded me. I thought it was another boat, maybe another fisherman, someone who could help me get back to the harbor. I pulled the engine cord and pointed the boat at the light, moving cautiously through the fog. But the closer I got, the stranger the light became. The light didn't sway like it would on a boat. It didn't move with the waves. It stood still, as if floating in the air. And when I was about 100 meters away, I realized that there was no silhouette behind the light, no boat, no person, nothing, only that golden light suspended on the surface of the water. A shiver ran down my spine. Yet I called out loud, "Hello, there's someone there." My voice faded into the fog. The light didn't. It moved. It didn't blink in response. It was just there waiting for me. Every instinct in my body yelled at me to turn around, to get away from that light. But something about it attracted me. I couldn't take my eyes off. Maybe if I got a little closer I'd understand what it was. So I kept the engine running, going slowly at about 50 mph. I turned off the engine and let the boat slide into the light. Then I heard it, a low, whispering sound. It was soft, almost like a song, a wordless melody floating on the water, like the echo of a forgotten dream. My pulse quickened. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, playing with my mind, but the singing grew louder, and below it I heard something else, a splash, as if something was moving in the water around my boat, spinning. Hello. I knocked again, but my voice sounded weak. The singing continued. The light descended a little more, as if something beneath it was pulling it into the water. I leaned over the edge of the boat, trying to see beyond the fog, and then I saw it, a face just below the surface of the water, pale, with eyes large and bright that glowed faintly in the darkness, lips that moved in synchronicity with the song. My blood froze, flickered, and the face faded into the depths, but the light was still closer there, too close. The fog lit up with its golden glow. CND for an instant. A beat later the light disappeared. It stopped, and the water was calm again. The silence that was left behind was worse. I stood paralyzed, waiting, listening, but there was nothing. With trembling hands I pulled the cord. I tried. Nothing again. The engine roared to life, accelerating, turning the boat at full speed in the opposite direction. No matter where I was going, just wanting to get away, I sailed during what seemed like the fog starting to dissipate little by little, until I finally saw the lights of the harbor on the horizon. When my boat hit the dock, I jumped ashore with my legs still shaking. The town barely woke up, the light of the dawn dyeing the sky a bluish gray. Everything seemed so normal, so mundane. I almost managed to convince myself that I had imagined everything. But when I looked out over the bay, I saw it, a faint glow slipping under the waves, receding into the depths. Since then I've told myself it was just the fog, just my mind playing tricks on me after a long night, but I never went out fishing at night again. The trips through highway, they're supposed to be fun. They don't fill the car with friends. You shop, snacks, you turn on the music at full volume, and you just let yourself go. We thought we'd been stuck in a rut for too long, and this trip was our big getaway. A chance to relax and see a little bit of the country. We were four, me, Sam, Lisa, and Jake. We'd been friends for years, so this was more than just a trip. It was something we were going to remember forever, and we did. But not for the reasons we expected. We left early in the morning with the intention of going as many miles as possible before dark. The first part of the trip was perfect. We stopped at a strange little restaurant that looked like something out of the 50s. We ate greasy burgers and kept going. Everything was going well until the second day. It was late in the afternoon, and we were on a back road surrounded by empty fields and trees that seemed to stretch to infinity. There were no gas stations, no houses, nothing. Just us and the road. I was at the wheel, letting Jake rest after we'd driven all morning. Sam was in the passenger seat and Lisa was sleeping in the back with her headphones on. The first thing that made me uncomfortable was in particular we had seen him at the last gas station where we had stopped. He was an old and rusty car, barely in working condition. At first I didn't think much about it, but the driver stayed in his seat, never got out of the car, never went into the store, just stood there looking at us. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something about his posture, in his stillness, that made me nervous. We finished to fill up the tank and we set off trying to forget the incident, but a few minutes later I checked the rearview mirror. There was the same car keeping the same distance following us. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe we were just going in the same direction, but as the miles went by I never overtook us. Never walked away, just kept there. Hey, someone else, he's noticing this, murmur Sam as he turned and frowned. Yes, he's been behind us since the gas station. Jake, who is now awake, leaned forward. They think he's following us. Lisa woke up to the conversation and sat down. Who, that car said, looking at the mirror again. She turned to look at it. Maybe it's just going the same way. It'll stop eventually. No, but it didn't. I sped up. I took a couple of random turns waiting that if it really was a coincidence, it would soon take another direction, but when I looked again, there was still, by then, the tension inside the car was palpable. Sam tried to joke, but no one. Lisa hugged herself, clearly uncomfortable. The minutes passed. The kilometers were still there. The sun began to set, dyeing the sky shades of orange and red. The road seemed to stretch eternally, without a single sign of civilization, and then, as if fate gave us a way out, a motel sign popped up. It was one of those rickety little places with neon lights flashing and an almost empty parking lot. We should stop here, Lisa said, her voice tense. Maybe leave us alone and stop us. I nodded with no other better choice, turned into the parking lot and parked under the dim light of a pole. The car followed us, parked at the other end of the lot. No, we got off slowly, trying to act normal. I felt my heart hammering in my chest as I glanced sideways at the car. The engine was still running. The driver wasn't coming out. We quickly went into the motel office. We paid cash and headed to the room, locked the door. The curtains were drawn, but we could still see the car from a small space between them. It was still there throughout the night, every night. Every time someone woke up and looked out the window, it was still there. The hours passed. The dawn came. When we got ready to leave, we plucked up the courage to check the car one last time. It was gone. A collective sigh of relief went around the room. Maybe it had gotten tired. Maybe we were just paranoid. We packed up quickly and left the parking lot. But when we took the road, there it was a couple of blocks ahead, waiting for us in fear. He came back suddenly, joined the traffic behind us, as if nothing had happened. We continued driving without saying a word. We tried to take detours, go on different roads, but he was always there. Lisa was no longer talking. Sam was constantly looking in the rearview mirror. Jake clenched his fists. After a couple of hours we arrived at a small people. We stopped in a busy parking lot, hoping that with so many people around he would finally leave. The car parked out on the other side of the lot, and this time the driver got out. I don't remember his face. I just remember the way he walked slowly, deliberately, as if he knew we couldn't escape. We locked ourselves in the car, but he didn't come over. He just stood there, looked at us for a moment, and then smiled. Not in a friendly way, not in a normal way. It was the smile of someone who knew something that we didn't. Then, without saying a word, he turned and walked away. Getting lost in the crowd, we stood there paralyzed, not knowing what to do. When we finally had the courage to get out, his car was still there. But we never saw him again. But every time I drive down an empty road at night, every time I look in the rearview mirror and see a car that doesn't overtake me, that just stays there. I wonder and if it's still going out there, and if you're just waiting for someone else to notice it, for someone else to follow you until it's too late. I've always loved the thrill of camping. There's just something about being out there with just the crunch of the fire and the rustle of the leaves that makes me feel really alive. But that last trip, the one I made, to a remote place deep in the national forest, made me feel really alive. It left me with a completely different feeling. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the feeling that I had seen something I shouldn't, that I had stumbled upon a place that was waiting for me. It was supposed to be a short 2-night trip, I had found a place away from the main trails, at the end of a dirt road so narrow that my truck barely fit. The forest was thick there. The pines stood tall so high that it seemed that they could touch the sky, their branches intertwining until they blocked even the midday sun. Was perfect, quiet, isolated, a small clearing, just big enough for my tent and a campfire. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the rest of the day exploring the surroundings. There was something strange in the forest. The air was too still. The sounds of the forest seemed muffled as soon as the singing was heard, not the murmur of a nearby stream, just the creaking of pine needles under my boots and my own breath. By the time the sun began to set, the sky turned a faint orange, the shadows of the trees stretching like fingers on the earth. He lit a fire and I sat down to watch the flames dance. But then I noticed it, the silence, a silence too deep, as if the forest. I wasn't holding my breath. It wasn't right, but I forced myself to ignore it. I told myself that I was letting myself be carried away by the stories that people tell about the forests, stories about things that people see out there, things that shouldn't be there. But when the fire went out and the night went on, I heard a slight sound, a click like the tapping of stones hitting softly against each other. I froze. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, not the random snap of falling branches or an animal moving through the undergrowth. Came from the darkness beyond the glow of my campfire. I took my flashlight with a trembling hand and directed the light towards the trees. Nothing, only twisted trunks and tangled shadows. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my ears, but the forest remained silent. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the discomfort. Only an animal, I said to myself. Or maybe pine cones falling. I went into the store, closing with nervous hands, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop hearing that sound in my head, and just as sleep was finally starting to catch up with me, the click came back closer, right outside the store. My blood froze. I held my breath. The click, 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 continued slowly, patient, as if something was waiting. My flashlight was next to. I grabbed my sleeping bag, and with a quick movement I opened the zipper of the tent and focused the light. Outside nothing, just the campfire almost extinguished and the dense darkness of the forest. But then I saw something. Just a flash on the ground right at the edge of the clearing. Two small stones placed on top of each other, as if someone or something had left them there. My mouth dried up. I slowly walked out of the tent, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I approached the stones. They were smooth, round. They seemed to be put there deliberately. Suddenly a shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned on my heels, shining the flashlight in all directions. The trees seemed tighter than before, the shadows denser, the air heavier, and then the sound came back. Click behind me. Click on my left. Click on my right. A cold sweat covered my eye. I took my backpack and put away the essentials. I had to leave as quickly as possible, but when I turned to the truck I saw another couple of stones closer, as if something was approaching. I didn't care about the camp anymore. I ran to my truck. I opened the door with a lock and locked inside. As soon as I was inside, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine didn't start. My heart hammers in my chest. I turned the key again. Nothing. The night outside was dense, but in the gloom I saw something move between the trees. Thin shadows, tall, watching me, waiting. Finally, the engine roared to life. I stomped on the accelerator. The headlights illuminated the trees. For an instant, and just before disappearing along the dirt road, I saw a figure in the rearview mirror, tall, too thin, head tilted to one side, watching me leave, smiling. I didn't stop until I got to the main road. I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night or the next. When I came back days later to pick up what I had left behind, the camp was intact except for one thing. The stones were dozens of them piled up in little mounds around the clearing, as if someone had been there waiting for me. I haven't gone back to that forest, and sometimes, when the night is too quiet, when the wind just moved the leaves outside my window, I think I hear it again, that click, 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 like something's never forgotten and I'm waiting for it to come back. You know, that kind of night where it's just you and the road, maybe a couple of stars in the sky. That feeling that you're the only person in the world was one of those nights. I'd been driving down a highway for hours, endless, empty. Fields on both sides, not a gas station or a restaurant, nothing for miles. It was close to midnight, maybe a little later, but the air was still warm. Summer had that way of holding on like it didn't want to leave. It was wide awake, just me, the hum of the engine and the headlights illuminating the darkness. I don't know exactly when I noticed it, maybe a few miles ago. It was just a glance at the rearview mirror, a reflex act, something routine, but there were a couple of headlights in the distance, just a tiny. Nothing unusual. Many people drive at night. It could be anyone. I kept driving. A few minutes later, I looked again at the car. It was still there, a little closer. This time it wasn't trying to overtake me, but it wasn't far behind either. I just kept the pace. I pressed the accelerator a little, putting some distance between us, letting the road get closer. If it opened, maybe it would happen, but it didn't. I couldn't help but feel a chill of unease. I told myself to calm down. I had been driving for hours. I was tired, maybe paranoid. People drive at night. Surely they hadn't even realized that they made me nervous. But the road was still empty except for me and those taillights in the mirror. I felt my neck tighten. I began to check the mirrors with more often. I don't know why I didn't let them pass me. I could have braked, moved the car to the side, but something stopped me. The way they were just there following me without changing the distance, it didn't sit well. I took a deep breath, let my eyes go back to the dark road and pressed my foot against the accelerator. The car responded by jumping forward, increasing speed. I felt the vibration of the road under the tires. The engine hum getting louder. I didn't look back for a while. I let the speed take me, feeling the slight adrenaline of going just over the limit. When I finally checked the mirror, my chest tightened. The lights were still there. They hadn't gotten closer. They were just there. For a second I felt stupid. I had let my mind race by itself. I told myself that I was just tired, that I was just another driver. So I slacked off on the steering wheel. I leaned back a little, tried to ignore the urge to look in the mirror again. The road stretched out, snaking a little, lined with trees that seemed to devour the light of my headlights. Was too quiet, and that only made me think more about the car behind me. My stomach contracted. I didn't realize that my knuckles were white from squeezing the steering wheel so much. I made a decision. I was going to stop. Maybe I just needed a break, and if they passed by, I better. Saw a rest area ahead, a small detour in on the side of the road. I turned on the turn signal. I started to slow down, feeling that strange feeling in your stomach that you have when you make a decision that you are not sure about. I checked the mirror. The car behind me did not accelerate. It did not pass me. Instead, it also began to slow down, matching my pace, staying right behind me. My heart started to beat hard. I did not understand why they slowed down too. It felt bad. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. So I stepped on the gas again, the road again, faster, this time, maybe too fast, but I didn't care. I kept looking at the mirror, hoping that those lights faded, that all this was just an anecdote to laugh at later, but they were still there. My back had got wet with cold sweat, my breathing was shallow and fast, and I felt that horrible feeling that I wasn't alone, that whoever was behind me was watching me, waiting. The road stretched out in front of me, long and empty. There were no exits, there were no detours, just me and that car. Harder pressed the accelerator, ignoring the feeling that my own car was struggling with speed. The road curves ahead, and I took it too fast. The tires squealed. Barely gripping on the asphalt, I felt my body lean with the car. For a second of weightlessness before straightening it, I looked at the mirror. The lights were still there. They took the curve just as easily, as if nothing happened. My heart hammers in my throat. It was like one of those nightmares where you can't run fast enough. Wherever you do, what chases you is always right behind me. I didn't want to think about what would happen if I stopped. I didn't want to know who was behind me. My stomach churned, a heavy hole forming there. Every fiber of my being was tense, waiting, listening to the hum of the engine, the wind roaring outside, the low murmur of the car behind me. I had never felt so alone, so exposed. And then, later on, I saw a glow of lights. A gas station finally was small, just a spot in the darkness, but it was something. I pointed at it, slowing down as I entered the parking lot. The feeling of relief was immediate, as if I had come out of a nightmare. The lights cast long shadows on the concrete, a small oasis at night. I looked at the mirror, hoping to see the car go on, waiting for it to finally pass. But number slowed down, went into the gas station, and parked just a couple of pumps away. I stayed in my car with my hands sticky on the steering wheel. I forced my breath to calm down, forcing myself to think maybe they just needed gas, maybe it was nothing, but I didn't believe it. The engine of the other car stayed on, muttering, as if I was waiting. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see who was inside. I thought about getting out, about pretending nothing was happening, but my body felt heavy, anchored by a silent fear. And then the driver's door of the another car opened up. A figure came out, moving slowly, too slowly. A shiver ran down my spine. The person began to walk towards my car, step by step, unhurriedly. I couldn't make out his face, just a shadow against the dim lights of the station. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I put the car in reverse. The tires squealed against the pavement as it shot out. my heart beating so hard that it choked everything else. I didn't like it. I looked like a lunatic. I didn't care if someone was watching. I just knew I had to go. I've always thought small towns are more unsettling just before dawn. When the streets are empty, window lights are out and the fog slips in slowly. It feels like time has stopped, as if the world is holding its breath. That's why I found myself driving through one of those towns at 4:30 in the morning, trying to get home after a long shift at the warehouse. It was supposed to be a quick shortcut, a detour, off the highway to avoid construction. But what I found there shouldn't have been on any map. The town seemed forgotten, a bunch of old brick buildings huddled against the dark sky. As I drove, I noticed the rusty, crooked sign, barely legible "Welcome to Grady's Hollow." The paint was peeling and a thick layer of moss crept up the side, as if nature itself had tried to claim it. My headlights illuminated shuttered shops, empty storefronts, and houses that had been uninhabited for years. But ahead, there was a light, a faint glow coming from a small gas station on the edge of town. My fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty, and the idea of running out of gas in this place was not attractive at all. So I turned towards the station, feeling the crunch of tires on the gravel. The light of the station was dim. It flickered as if struggling to stay on. There was an old gas pump of the type with a rotating sphere and a small booth that served as an office. Through the dusty window I could see shelves full of old snacks and magazines and a dim light behind the counter. I got out of the car and wrapped myself better in my jacket as I felt the cold air of the early morning. I walked to the pump, and a bell rang as I crossed under the awning, but the sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the fog that clung to the edges of the parking lot. I took the hose, but the pump was old, the kind that required you to pay inside before filling the tank. I sighed, and I glanced around the road expecting to see lights in the distance. But the village was still shrouded in fog, silent and motionless. I pushed open the office door and another bell rang above my head. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and motor oil, a scent that reminded me of my grandfather's garage. The place was cluttered with dusty shelves and a counter, covered in old receipts. Behind the counter, an old man. He was hunched over something. His face was furrowed by wrinkles and he had a weather-worn expression. He was wearing a flannel shirt that looked as old as the building, and at first he didn't seem to notice my presence. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound friendly, although my skin stood up with a sense of discomfort. The old man looked up slowly. His eyes caught the light for a second, and there was something strange about them. They were too sharp, too bright for someone his age. Sharp, too bright for someone his age, he smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, son," he replied in a harsh voice like grav. "What brings you to Grady's Hollow at this hour?" I hesitated, glancing at the empty street. "I'm just passing through. I need to fill up the tank," he nodded, reaching for an old cash register that rang with a loud clank when he pressed the keys. "Not many people pass by here," he already said with casual tone, but there was something about his way of saying it, as if hinting at something I didn't understand. "You must have taken a wrong turn." I forced a laugh, trying to hide my discomfort. "Yes, I guess so. But I'll be back on the road as soon as I fill up the tank." The old man nodded again, but his smile persisted, as if he knew something, that I didn't hand me the receipt, and I turned to leave anxiously for finish this, but when I was about to open the door his voice stopped me. "Be careful on the road, son. Things around here don't like strangers." I stood motionless with my hand on the knob. I turned my head to ask him what he meant, but when I looked at him again, he had lowered his eyes, occupied with something behind the counter, as if he had never spoken. I shook off the feeling of chill that I climbed up my back and out into the cold again, filled the tank as fast as I could, casting furtive glances at the parking lot, feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, something hidden right beyond the glare of the light. When I finished, I put the hose in place and ran back to the car, eager to get away from the town. When I joined the road, the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the edges of the buildings until the town disappeared behind me. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, but I dismissed it, telling me that he was just trying to scare me. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the gas station disappear in the distance. I pressed the accelerator, listening to the buzz of the tires against the asphalt. But after a few minutes the road began to look different. The trees on both sides became denser, their branches between the trees on the road, forming a tunnel of shadows. The air inside the car grew colder, my breath in a handkerchief breezes, and the fog seemed to take on a life of its own. Music. Swirling figures that dissolved as soon as I tried to focus on them. I kept driving, my hands clutching the steering wheel, my pulse racing with each curve. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees, more fog. I tried to tell myself that the old man was right, that I had taken a wrong detour, but my GPS couldn't find a signal and the road signs had stopped appearing like this for miles. Just as I was starting to panic, I saw something ahead, a faint glow through the fog. Relief washed over me. I thought maybe I had found another town, a place where I could find my way around, but when I got closer, my stomach sank. The light wasn't coming from a town. It was coming from the gas station. I slammed on the brakes on the tires, skidding in the middle of the road. My heart was pounding when I saw the neon sign flickering through the fog. The same pump, the same dusty cars parked outside, the same place I had just left behind. But that was impossible. I had been driving straight for miles. I squeezed the steering wheel tightly, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It couldn't be the same place. It didn't make sense. And yet there was the gas in the fog waiting for me. With shaky hands, I slowly turned the car back to the parking lot. I couldn't just keep driving without knowing what was going on. I had to understand it. I turned off the engine and got out of the car. The bell over the door rang again as I pushed the entrance of the office, and the smell of motor oil and old wood hit me immediately. Just like before, the old man was still sitting behind the counter. This time he wasn't busy with anything. He didn't look surprised to see me. It was like he'd been waiting for you. "I told you, son," he said in an even softer voice. "This time things around here don't like strangers." My mouth went dry and I took a step back as I stammered how I ended up back here. The old man smiled, and this time there wasn't a trace of kindness in his expression. Just something like that to tiredness or resignation. "Some roads won't let you go," he answered. "No, unless they want to." I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed up to the door, almost tripping over the threshold. In my desperation to get out, my mind was running, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I got in the car, started the engine and stepped on the accelerator, shooting out of the parking lot. The fog continued to envelop the road, dense and oppressive. But no, I had to keep driving. But the road was lengthening, twisting and curving in impossible ways, as if it were caught in an endless loop. The trees on either side seemed to get closer, their branches spreading out over the road like bony fingers. And no matter how much I drove, I always ended up in the same place. I always came back to the gas station, flashing lights, the dusty hut, and the old man waiting. I don't know how long I've been driving, for hours, days. The weather doesn't seem to work the same way here. I keep trying. I keep hoping to find a way out, but the fog never lifts. The trees never change, and the neon sign is always waiting for me right at the next bend. And sometimes on the darkest nights when the fog is thicker, I think I see figures moving through the trees, shadows whispering at the edge of my hearing. No, I understand the words, but I know they're calling me, waiting for me to give up, but I can't stop. I can't let them get me, so I keep driving, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the road will take pity on me and bring me back to the world I left behind. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would go on a cruise ship. All that open sea, the infinite horizon, always seemed too empty, too isolated to me. But when my friends convinced me to join them on a week-long trip, promising to talk non-stop about luxury, the freedom to float among exotic islands, but no one warned me about the things you might find when you're so far from shore, things that don't appear in the brochures. It was our third night in Alta, somewhere between two small Caribbean islands, with no land in sight the first few days. It had been normal to lounge by the pool, watch stunning sunsets, enjoy overpriced cocktails. But that third night the atmosphere changed. A thick fog rolled over the water just after dinner, swallowing the stars and turning the ocean into a black void. The lights on the ship seemed weaker, as if the fog sucked them in. By midnight, most of the passengers had already gone to sleep. I wasn't sleepy, so I decided to walk around the lower decks where everything was quieter. I liked the stillness, the hum of the engine vibrating through the floor. But as I made my way down the hallway, I noticed that the air felt different, colder, almost humid, and for some reason the lights seemed dimmer than before. I walked past one of the big portholes, hoping to see only more fog, but something made me stopping outside in the thick mist. I saw what appeared to be a figure, a shadow floating just above the waterline, moving at the same speed as the boat. At first I thought it was just a reflection, a trick of light, but when I entered, I closed my eyes and approached the glass. The figure seemed to move, gliding with an unnatural fluidity, blinking, rubbing my eyes, and when I looked again it was gone. I swallowed hard and forced myself to continue walking, telling myself that it had only been my imagination. But the feeling of unease did not go away. I decided to go up to the observation deck, waiting for the fresh air to clear my mind. When I arrived, the fog was even thicker, swirling as if it had a life of its own. I leaned on the edge looking towards the blackness of the ocean. Nothing but dark water, and the lights of the ship could be seen reflecting off the haze. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound as if someone was hitting the hull of the boat. Tap, tap, tap. I stood motionless, trying to make it out above the hum of the engine. The sound came back, tap, 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 louder this time, as if something was touching the boat from outside. I peeked out more, straining my eyes through the fog, and then just below the surface I saw something move. Something dark. The figure this time was closer. Right at the water's edge, I jumped away from the railing, my heart hammering into my chest. Turned to run, but just at the other end of the deck I saw something that stopped me in secco, a tall, thin silhouette, too thin. His arms were normally long, his movements clumsy, as if he were mimicking the way a human walks, but not understanding how to do it really. For a second I thought it was another passenger, but then he turned his head towards me. His face was pale, expressionless, and his eyes were two voids, dark, deep, lifeless. I didn't think, I just ran. My footsteps echoed on the metal staircase as I came down from the deck. The corridor seemed to lengthen before me, the lights flickering faintly. The tapping continued. Tap, 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 as if something was following me, touching the walls. I arrived at my cabin with hands trembling as I struggled to get the key into the lock. The door slammed open and I threw myself inside, closing it behind me, standing there with my back against the door, breathing heavily. The room was in complete darkness save for a thin strip of light filtering in from the hallway, and then I saw something move, a shadow sliding out of my window. My blood froze. I walked over slowly, with a quickening pulse. The curtains moved, but the window was closed, or I thought so, because when I looked at the glass I saw prints, long, thin finger marks pressed against the inside. I didn't sleep the rest of the trip. I stayed in the busiest areas of the ship, avoiding the dark corridors and empty decks. My friends noticed I was different. They asked me if I was sick, but I couldn't tell them what I had seen. Even I didn't want to believe it. On the last night of the cruise I mustered up enough courage to ask a crew member about the fog if anyone else had seen anything unusual. The man looked at me silently for a long moment, then forced a smile. "Sometimes the sea plays tricks on you," he said quietly. "It's easy to get lost in the fog." But then his expression changed. His voice descended to a whisper. "Yes, do you ever hear the knocking? Ignore it, don't. Open the window, don't look too closely." I tried to laugh, pretend it was just a story to scare tourists, but the shiver on my spine told me I wasn't joking. When we finally disembarked, I was the first one off the ship. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything was watching me from the fog. But sometimes on nights when the fog builds up, and the fog builds, wind blows against my window, I still hear it tap, 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 and no matter how many miles I put between the ocean and I know that somewhere in the fog that shadow keeps waiting for me to hear it again. There's something about long journeys on country roads that makes you feel like you're floating in time. The landscape barely changes, miles of rolling fields and dark silos rising like sentinels on the horizon. It's easy to get lost in the rhythm of the road, in the buzz of the tires, in the constant swaying of the car. That's how I ended up on a two-lane road. I walked through endless fields. The sun had already set, leaving only a swath of dying light on the edge of the world. I had left the last village behind hours ago, and my only company was the barns, abandoned roads that appeared from time to time on the edges of the fields, their structures crumbling in the night. The road was empty, not a single headlight ahead, not a single one behind me. I turned on the radio, but found only static. It was then that I saw the sign for a secondary road, Willow Lane. The letters were old, faded, as if they hadn't been retouched in decades. I thought maybe it would be a shortcut, a way to shorten my way, or maybe I was just tired of the monotony of the highway, so I turned, leaving the main road behind. The pavement was rough. The car shook as it passed over forgotten potholes. The fields gave way to dense forest. The trees towered on either side, leaning over the road as if trying to close it. I turned on the high beams. The road was still snaking like a snake in the shadows. There were no signs. There were no lampposts. Nothing, and then I saw them, high, weathered pillars of stone, an old woman standing on either side of the road like the entrance to something time had forgotten. A wrought iron arch connected them with rusty words, barely legible among the willow, stake brush, and beyond the entrance, a fallen gate open as if inviting anyone to pass. I braked. I looked beyond the pillars, a gravel path into the dark, winding wood, barely visible beyond the first trees. I could have turned around. I could have gone back to the highway. But something in that place drew me in like it had been waiting for me, so I turned the steering wheel and took the gravel road, listening to the crunch of the stones under the tires. The trees closed more around me. The shadows grew. The air became denser. I drove, and for what seemed like an eternity, the curves of the road guiding me more and more farther into the woods, and then the road opened up to a tall, narrow, dark house, the windows black as empty wells, the porch sunken, the paint peeling. The wind blew rustling through the dead leaves on the ground. I left the engine running. My headlights illuminated the front of the house, casting twisted shadows against the old wood. For some reason my chest tightened. I wasn't supposed to be here, but I came down from the anyway. The gravel creaked under my feet. The air smelled musty, rotten wood. I climbed the porch steps, creaked under my weight. The door was ajar. I pushed carefully. It opened with a low groan inside. The air was thick, dusty. A large chandelier hung from the ceiling, covered in cobwebs. The furniture was covered with yellowish sheets, as if someone had expected to return. But never did. An old clock of foot stood in the corner, its hands frozen in a forgotten moment. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me. Darkness seemed to creep nearer, and then I heard it, a whisper from upstairs, a light sound like the cloth rose on the floor, or the echo of a bare foot. Fear paralyzed me. I raised the flashlight and focused on the hallway. The portraits hung on the walls seemed to be watching me, dark eyes, expressions frozen in time. I didn't want to go on, but I did. Something pushed me to do it. The floor creaked under my steps. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. At the end of the corridor, a half-open door. A dim light filtered through the crack. I approached. My hand trembled when I pushed the door. The room was almost empty. Just a small desk in the center, and above it an open drawer inside. An old object, a little music box. The figurine inside was slowly spinning to the rhythm of a melody that sounded like a distant, hypnotizing, ancient whisper. I drew closer. My fingers brushed against the dusty wood. The music stopped, and in the reflection of the dusty glass of the box I saw something behind me. A tall, somber figure, motionless, too close. My breath got stuck in my throat. I turned suddenly. Nothing. The room was empty. The air, it was cold, suffocating. The shadows seemed deeper. The grandfather clock rang downstairs. 1 knock, 2, 3. Something had moved in the hallway. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I ran downstairs. My feet hit the wood hard. The front door rose in front of me. I yanked open it. The icy night air enveloped me. I rushed towards my car, closing the door behind me with a bang. The engine roared as I turned the key. The lights lit up the house one last time, and in one of the dark windows on the second floor, I saw a shadow move. I stomped on the accelerator. The trees faded as the road closed back on me. The gravel road seemed to lengthen, as if it didn't want to let me go. But in the end I found the exit. I went back to the highway, to the safety of civilization. I haven't looked for Willow Lane again. I don't even know if it really existed. But sometimes, when the wind blows hard in the night, I think I hear the melody of that music box like it's calling me back, waiting to see if I'll stay this time. I've always liked to camp. The solitude of the forest, the crackle of the campfire, the way the night envelopes. There's something about being away from civilization that makes everything feel clearer, simpler. So when my friend Kyle suggested a weekend trip to a remote place he'd found in the middle of the forest, I accepted without a second thought. It was just the two of us, a tent, and miles of unspoiled nature. However, the deeper you go into the woods, the more you realize that there are places not made for visitors. Doors. We left early that Friday morning with a car loaded with equipment and the sky a perfect blue. It took us almost 4 hours to reach the trailhead, and then another 2, walking along a path barely visible among the trees. The further we went, the more the sounds of the outside world faded away. The trees grew tall and old, their thick trunks blocking the light. From the sun to the afternoon, we arrived at the clearing that Kill had promised us. It was a small space of flatland surrounded by a ring of huge pine trees. As if the place had been waiting for us, we pitched the tent near the edge of the clearing and prepared a fire. The air was fresh, and the aroma of apex became more intense with the sunset. But as the night progressed, something changed everything. It felt different. It was then that we heard the first noise, a faint whisper through the trees, just beyond the glow of the campfire. I thought it was the wind, but the air was completely still. Kale heard it too. He turned his head with a frown. "Probably a deer," he said, but his tone didn't sound very convinced. I tried to ignore him, concentrating on the fire, but the sound didn't go away. He moved around the clearing, always staying just right. Out of reach of the light for a moment, I thought I saw something move through the trees, a flash of pale skin there, and then nothing. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to calm down. "We're in the woods," I said to myself. "The animals are everywhere." The night moved on and the noise disappeared. Finally we got into the store. Although I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, Kyle fell asleep in seconds. I Nero, the silence was too dense, almost oppressive. At some point tiredness overcame me, but then, in the middle of the night, a sound woke me up suddenly. Tap, 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 a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was touching the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, my mind spinning. Kale was still asleep next to me. The tapping came back now on the other side of the tent, as if something was walking around us. My throat was dry. I reached out and shook Kyle's shoulder. He woke up blinking. "What's up?" he muttered before he could answer. He heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Kyle sat up instantly, his eyes wide open. We looked at each other in the darkness, not daring to move for a moment. The silence returned. Then something brushed against the tent. A slow movement, as if someone was, and the palm of his hand on the tarp. Kyle took the flashlight, and with a gasping breath, he lit it. The inside of the tent lit up, but there was nothing inside with us. The silhouette on the outside, it was gone. We stood there without speaking until dawn began to light up the forest. When we finally came out, we looked for footprints, but the ground around the tent was intact. No broken branches, no footprints in the wet earth, as if it hadn't been there in all the night. Kale tried to make a joke about it, but his hands were shaking. We decided to stay another night. We convinced ourselves it was just our imagination, but the forest didn't feel cozy anymore. We spent the day by the river, avoiding the clearing, but even there the discomfort followed us for the afternoon. The fog began to settle between the trees, dense, heavy, as if something was approaching. We lit the fire early that at night. We sat near the flames, attentive to any sound, and then, as if waiting for us, the noises came back, this time closer. The rustling of branches, a dull drag through the undergrowth. Kyle grabbed the flashlight and pointed at the trees. Nothing. Then the light went down. For an instant, and there was a hunched figure, hidden among the trunks, his limbs too long, his head tilted at an impossible angle. He did not know. Kyle dropped the flashlight suddenly, and the light flickered when it hit the ground. When I looked again at the figure, he was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed by the campfire, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of dry leaves, the snap of branches breaking under an invisible weight. Every now and then we thought we saw something move on the periphery of the fire, but never enough to be sure. At some point I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up with the feeling that something was right above me. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow leaning over me, breathing. Its breath was icy against my skin. I screamed and sat up, but there was nothing there anymore. Kyle was sitting by the ashes of the campfire with his eyes open and his face pale. "We are leaving." I didn't argue. We packed everything up in minutes. We didn't it matter to leave things behind. The sun had barely risen when we started the hike back, but the forest was still silent, too quiet, as if it knew we were leaving. When we got to the car, we were relieved. I looked down the trail one last time, and there among the trees I saw something small, dark, watching us. We got in the car and drove off without looking back. We never talked about what happened in that woods. Kyle never suggested another camping trip again. I stopped venturing alone, but some nights, when the wind shakes the windows and the shadows lengthen, I remember that tapping in the tent, that icy breath in my, and I know that in some corner of that forest they are still waiting for us. There's something unsettling about abandoned places. You don't think about it until you're standing there in front of a lifeless, purposeless, but that night we didn't think about it. We were just walking around looking for something to do, going through a quiet stretch of farmland. Everything looked so still, as if the whole world had stopped. We had been there for a while, driving down narrow roads, laughing, listening to music, enjoying the night breeze. And then, if I had warned her, we saw a country house, its silhouette silhouetted against the dark sky, a huge, motionless shadow. The headlights of the car illuminated the front porch, and something in its appearance made us stop. There were no warning signs or planks blocking the entrance. Only a dead house, and in silence the wind blew, making the windows creak that seemed to be hollow eyes watching us, but we were curious, and curiosity is usually the first step towards disaster. "Let's take a look," Sarah said. The others didn't hesitate to nod. Mike and Ben were just as enthusiastic. No one questioned the idea. So we pulled over a patch of grass grown by the road. We left the car lights on to light the way, and we got out. The air felt dense, heavy, as if something invisible was pressing you. Leading the group, we walked towards the house, the stones and dry grass rustling under our feet. Sarah turned on the flashlight of her phone, the ace of light cutting through the darkness and revealing tiny particles of dust floating in the air. For some reason, I stayed a little behind, watching the others climb the porch steps. Something made me feel uncomfortable. I felt a tingling in the back of my neck. I shook my sensation. "Just nerves," I said to myself. I pushed the door open with a long, high-pitched groan. The interior was completely still. It smelled of dust, rotten wood and something else, something I couldn't identify. We entered the ground, creaked under our steps. Dust floated in the air as if no one had been there in decades. We could barely see beyond a couple of meters. Only silhouettes of old furniture, a staircase that was lost in the darkness, pieces of broken objects scattered on the floor. Mike ran the flashlight over the walls. "It's as if time had stopped here," he whispered. We continued exploring, our footsteps echoing in the still air. The house, it was unsettling, yes, but in a way that seemed explainable. It was just an old and forgotten place until Sarah stopped. "What's up?" I asked, getting closer. She didn't answer. She just pointed her flashlight to the ground there. In the layer of dust in front of the stairs, there was a single perfect clean footprint, as if someone had been there just a few minutes ago, but the rest of the dust around it wasn't upset. My stomach twisted. "Maybe it's ours, Mike." But his voice sounded more like a wish than an impossible certainty. Sarah murmured, "We haven't walked around." Ben shrugged. "Sure, someone's been here before, it's not uncommon." We moved into another room, trying to shake off our uneasiness. The place was in ruins. The walls covered in torn wallpaper, the furniture sunk in dust and dirt. I ran my hand over a table, leaving a clean trail in the layer of accumulated dirt, and then we heard it, a soft sound, a whisper of movement coming from above. We stood still. I held my breath, straining for the sound. Came again, a slow drag, as if something was moving, just moving, too heavy to be too human. "Maybe it's a raccoon," Mike murmured. Although his tone didn't convince anyone, Sarah shook her head, her big, dark eyes under the dim light of the flashlight. "It's too big. We shouldn't have gone." That was the time, but no one wanted to say it out loud. But we were all thinking the same thing. We climbed the stairs. It was narrow, every step creaking under our weight. Felt every cell of my body in tension. Something wasn't right. When we got to the top, the corridor stretched out in front of us, a row of half-open doors. Some hung on their hinges, some were closed. The air was colder there, and that smell was stronger. We moved slowly with careful steps. Sarah's lantern was shaking. In his hand, casting distorted shadows on the walls, we came to the first door. It was barely ajar, and on the other side I saw something, a flash of movement. A shadow. My heart raced. I looked at the others. I had seen it too. Mike swallowed hard. "Just let's take a look." He pushed the door. The room was empty, except for a mirror in the corner, but in the reflection there was something else, something that wasn't in the room at all. Motionless figure, had no face, just a dark outline, as if the shadow itself had risen from the ground. My breath got stuck in my throat. It didn't move, it didn't make any noise, it just watched us. It blinked and disappeared. But the feeling that it was still there didn't go away. No one spoke, no one moved, and then a sound came from the hallway. A soft rhythmic tapping, as if someone was touching the wall with the fingers. We turned around. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched became more intense. "We leave," I whispered without waiting for an answer. We turned around and hurried back to the stairs, but just when we reached the edge of the landing, Sarah froze. What did she start to say? But her voice died away. We turned there, at the end of the corridor, standing next to the last door. There was something not I saw well, only a shadow darker than darkness, but we knew it was looking at us. We froze. The air in the house seemed to grow denser, as if crushing us. Then the figure took a step, made no noise, but the ground beneath us creaked as if the house itself felt its presence. We ran, went down the stairs so fast that we almost stumbled. We didn't look back, we didn't stop. We went through the living room. We went out to the porch, and we threw ourselves into the car. The headlights were still on, casting long shadows on the tall grass. I started the engine with shaky hands and shot off. No one spoke. No one looked back. We just walked away. But even now, months later, when I'm alone, I feel that presence, that moment before it all broke loose, and I wonder if we'd stayed a little longer what would have happened. It's funny how your perspective on stops changes. Restful when you're on the road, late at night. Daytime, they're just places where you can have a coffee, stretch your legs, maybe take a quick nap in the car. But after midnight, they turn into something completely different. Lonely concrete parks surrounded by darkness with twinkling lights that never seem bright enough. I've spent enough nights driving across the country to know which stops feel safe and which ones didn't, but that night I had no choice. The effect of the caffeine was gone and my eyelids were heavy like lead, so I diverted Gonzalez music from what I expected. With a chill that pierced my jacket as I got out of the car, I walked to the bathroom, my footsteps echoing over the pavement, the murmur of the highway fading into the background. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're invading a place even if no one else is around. I sped El Paso, feeling that irrational urge to get in, to have the bathroom around me, was as dreary as I had imagined. Dirty tiles, a cracked mirror over the sink, and a flickering light that cast strange shadows on the walls, but I was too tired to care. Splashed to the bottom of the bathroom, swaying slightly from side to side as if I could see the edge of the door move with the flickering light, but the shadows inside the cubicle were too dense to make out anything else. I frowned and turned off the tap. The dripping water sounded deafening in the stillness. For a moment I thought I heard something, a slight creak like the fabric RC against the tiles. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud, too small against the walls of the bathroom. No, there was an answer. The door kept swinging, squeaking softly with each movement. I told myself that it was probably just a draft, that the building was old and worn, but my feet were still nailed to the ground with a feeling of unease in the back of my neck. After a few more seconds I shook my head, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. I turned again to the sink, but just at that moment the door of the bathroom behind me creaked as it opened. The sound made me jump, and I turned around expecting to see another traveler, someone who had stopped there in search of a break like me, but there was no one. The door slowly closed, the heavy metal hitting the with a dull rumble. I stood there feeling a sudden tightness in my chest, the skin bristling with a cold sweat. Something was not right in that place, and I couldn't identify what it was. I took a paper towel and wiped my face, trying to shake off the feeling of uneasiness, but when I turned to get out, I caught a glimpse of a quick and somber movement in the cubicle at the back. I froze with my pulse hitting my ears. For a second I thought I saw a hunched and deformed figure, but when I turned, the door of the cubicle was still swinging empty. I swallowed hard of suddenly. Desperate to get out of there and get back to the relative safety of my car, I headed for the door, but just as I reached it, the light above me flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment before flashing again. And in that very brief moment I would swear I saw a pair of dark, wide-open eyes staring at me from the gap under the cubicle door. I pushed open the door of the eye soaked tightly, the psalm staggering between the cars too deep. I glanced at the bathroom, half expecting to see someone staring at me from the door, but the entrance was empty, the light above it still flickering and buzzing. I hurried to my car. The stones creaked under my boots as I pulled the driver's door handle. My hands trembled as I searched for the keys, with the feeling of those eyes still burning in my eyes. My mind was about to start the engine when I heard it, soft and faint as if floating in the breeze, a whisper that slid through the parking lot. You dropped something." I froze with my hands suspended over the ignition key, straining to hear the voice. It echoed faintly, a distant sound that felt oddly disembodied, as if it emerged from nowhere in particular. I glanced in the rearview mirror, yearning to catch a glimpse of someone lurking behind the car. The parking lot lay deserted, a series of vacant spaces punctuated by a handful of cars bathed in the soft glow of dim lighting. I compelled myself to pivot, bracing for the sight of the cubicle door flung wide, or, even more unsettling, a figure looming just behind me. Yet there was nothing. The wind rustled through the trees at the edge of the parking lot, and I attempted to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that it was merely a trick of my imagination. Deceptive tactics, yet the sound emerged feeble and empty. I inserted the key into the ignition, and the engine sprang to life with a powerful roar. Without hesitation, I sped out of the parking lot. The glow of my headlights pierced the night as I raced back onto the road. Yet the sense of unease lingered, refusing to fade away. As my thoughts lingered like a distant shadow, a sense of calm washed over my nerves. I switched on the radio, allowing the comforting buzz of static to envelop me. The silence almost convinced me that it had all been in my head, that the late hour and the long trip were playing tricks on me, until I noticed something strange in the passenger seat. A paper folded carefully rested on the bag I had left there. My stomach twisted, and with fingers unfolded it, scribbled with dark and irregular strokes, "You dropped this." I almost went off the road, my heart hammered in my chest. I had been alone at that rest stop. I was sure of it. No one had come close enough to leave anything inside my car. I threw the note to the ground, trying to concentrate on but my hands were slippery with sweat, and I couldn't stop staring at the empty seat next to me. The miles passed, the dark stretch of desert stretching out in front of me. But the feeling that I wasn't alone, it didn't disappear every time my headlights illuminated a bend in the road. I thought I saw a shadow moving right at the edge of the lights, something that kept pace with the truck gliding in and out of the darkness. I finally pulled up at a gas station on the outskirts of town, my hands still shaking as I parked under the bright lights. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the empty parking lot, waiting for that feeling of being watched to fade, but it never did. Eventually I drove the rest of the way home with the note still crumpled on the floor of the passenger seat. I kept the radio off, listening attentively for any sound that might give away a presence in the car with me. But the silence was absolute. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Part of me knows that I was alone. They'd laugh, they'd tell me it was all in my head, that long trips can do that to one person. But every time I pass by a rest stop at night, I think of those eyes in the mirror, and the whisper that seemed to come out of nowhere, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, on some forgotten stretch of highway, something, it's still waiting for something. It's still looking for to the next person who's too tired to keep driving and make the mistake of stopping. And if I listen carefully enough, sometimes I just sometimes think I hear that distant voice blown by the wind again. You dropped something. I've driven through the desert at night more times than I can count. There's a kind of peace in it. The way the immensity stretches out on both sides, the starry sky, so bright it almost seems within reach, but there's also something unsettling about the way the darkness seems to be hiding things right beyond the reach of the headlights. I never thought I'd have reason to fear those empty stretches. Not until I saw those lights. I was on a route between Phoenix and Las Vegas, on one of those long, nameless roads that rarely see traffic afterwards. I was carrying a trailer full of building materials, and I hoped to make enough progress before the heat hit hard at dawn. The night was Clara, the road Lisa, just me and the constant hum of the engine. The first hours passed smoothly. The landscape glided like an ocean of shadows, but shortly after midnight I saw them, two weak lights, flashing in the distance. At first, I thought they were the tail lights of another vehicle ahead. Maybe someone with the turn signals would come on. But the closer I got, the closer I noticed that something wasn't right. They moved strangely. They swayed back and forth on the road, too high to belong to a car. I frowned, leaning in curiosity, overcoming my common sense. The lights slid to the side of the road, floating on the sand. I parked on the shoulder, turning off the engine. The silence of the desert enveloped me, and the lights were still there. They floated about 50 yards from the road, casting faint shadows on the dusty ground. They swayed gently as if caught in a breeze. I pulled out my phone, thinking about taking a picture. But as soon as I picked it up, the lights disappeared, like someone had turned off, a switch flashing, rubbing together. I had imagined it, but before I could convince myself that they did come back closer, just across the road, a chill ran down my spine. I had no idea what they were, but they seemed to call me against instinct. I opened the truck door and lowered my boots. They creaked on the gravel. The air was colder than it should be. I took a few steps towards them, and they backed away as if they wanted me to follow them. I advanced across the road. I reached the edge of a riverbed, a crevice dried in the ground where a stream once ran. The lights floated over the bottom of the riverbed, casting a quivering glow on the sand, and beneath them something stirred within me, a lump, a body. My heart raced as I leaped down the slope. There he lay, face down in a dusty flannel shirt, his skin unnaturally pale. I knelt beside him, calling out, "Hey, listen," and reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers made contact, the lights flickered out, and the air pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I fumbled for my flashlight, illuminating the riverbed, but the man had vanished. No footprints marred the sand, only the whisper of the wind. I sprang to my feet, breath quickening, scanning the desolate landscape for any sign of life. The desert stood still, the riverbed silent. I stumbled back, my boots slipping in the loose sand, and when I finally reached the road, my hands trembled so violently that I struggled to open the truck door. Once inside, I fired up the engine, my foot pressing down on the accelerator as the road vanished beneath the wheels. I looked one last time in the mirror. The lights had come back, sighed over the sand, pulsing softly, waiting, calling, but no, I looked back. Not this time. When I got to the first diner on the road, I staggered in, trembling, bowed my head, saw something in the road, asked quietly, looked up. His eyes were studying me with haunting understanding. Lights, light, you murmur slowly. You're not the first. What are they? His expression hardened. Some people think they're trapped souls or warnings. His voice dropped even lower, but sometimes they're an invitation. A chill ran through me back. I took a sip of coffee, trying to calm my nerves. Someone has tried to follow them. She looked at me for a long second. No one who came back to tell me about it. That was the last time I drove down that road at night, but sometimes when I drive through the desert I see a blue flash in the corner of my eye, a blink in the distance, and every time I fight the temptation to turn the steering wheel because I know who are out there waiting, calling me, and this time I may not be able to resist the invitation. There's a kind of silence that you only find deep in the forest, miles from any town or road. It's not like the silence of an empty room or a sleeping city. It's a silence that seems alive, like silos, trees, and the earth were listening, waiting for something. I used to love that feeling, the idea of being completely disconnected from everything, only a small part of the forest. But after what happened on my last camping trip, that silence fills me with a terror that I can't shake. I had been planning the trip for weeks, a weekend of camping alone in a remote part of a national forest that I had never explored. It was supposed to be an opportunity to relax, escape the noise of everyday life, and pass a few days just with my thoughts on nature. I chose a spot several miles from the nearest trail, a small clearing I found in an old topographic map, and I left early in the morning with my backpack and my map. By the time I got to the clearing, the sun was already starting to descend, casting long shadows among the trees. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, with a small stream winding along the edge of the clearing. I pitched my tent, lit a fire, and sat watching the last light disappear from the sky. The air was fresh with that earthy scent of pines and leaves damp, and I felt that familiar thrill of being there all alone as night fell and the sky filled with stars. The forest grew darker than I expected. The moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds, leaving only the flickering glow of my campfire. I cooked a quick dinner over the flames, listening to the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But after a while I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest had faded away, as if every living thing had decided to hold its breath. I convinced myself that I was just getting scared for no reason. I had a good book with me. I focused on that, allowing the fire to crackle softly in the background. Yet the silence began to gnaw at me. I found myself glancing up from the pages, yearning to catch a glimpse of something hidden beyond the forest's glare. As the fire crackled around midnight, I finally made the decision to surrender to sleep. I extinguished the flames, watching the embers sizzle and fade into the night. My tent, small yet cozy, beckoned me inside, where I tried to push aside the restlessness that had settled in my chest. I reassured myself that come morning, everything would feel different. I would awaken to the sweet melodies of birds and sunlight streaming through the trees. Just as I began to drift off, a faint sound pierced the stillness outside my tent, a soft, rhythmic scratch, as if something was being dragged across the forest floor. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. Beyond the pounding of my heart, the sound was subtle, elusive, and I couldn't quite determine its source, but it was undeniably close, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, ready to confront the unknown. The brilliant beam sliced through the tent's gloom, creating stark silhouettes, yet it offered no comfort or sense of security. I inhaled deeply and carefully unzipped the door, just enough to peek out and shine the light into the clearing. The brilliant light sliced through the trees, casting a glow on tangled roots and glistening leaves, yet the clearing remained vacant. No evidence of any activity lingered in the air. I might have been the one to create that sound. I surveyed the surroundings for a few more moments, but when nothing stirred, I compelled myself to ease up, reassuring myself that it was merely an animal wandering through, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. I closed the store once more, yet the sense of loneliness I had expected didn't linger as strongly as I had imagined. I lay there, sensing that they were immersed in the silence for what felt like hours, anticipating the return of sound. Yet, as exhaustion set in, a comforting realization washed over me. I was not alone. It engulfed me, leaving me adrift and uneasy. As I opened my eyes, I found myself enveloped in darkness within the store. The air was frigid and motionless, and my watch glowed 3:17 a.m. For a fleeting moment, I struggled to grasp the reality that I had awakened. Then I heard it again, the same scraping sound, but this time louder, as if I were right outside the store. My mouth dried up and I sat up, holding on to the flashlight as if I had been a lifeline as stealthily as possible. Let slide off the clasp, it seemed thunderous in the stillness. I turned on the flashlight and directed the ace out. The clearing looked different under the light of the flashlight, darker, more distorted. The shadows twisted in a way that made my skin crawl, and then I saw the footprints in the ground surrounding my camp. They were fresh, too fresh. Every footstep was deep and Clara on the loose earth, as if someone had walked in circles around my tent while I slept. My heart hammers in my chest. I turned the flashlight in all directions, my pulse racing, but there was no one there, just the empty forest and the dark shapes of the trees. I backed up inside the tent and hurriedly zipped, my mind working at full speed. Maybe it was another camper, someone who had gone off the trail, but I knew that it didn't make sense. There shouldn't be anyone else there, not so far from the nearest road, and if I was just a hiker, why hadn't it been announced? Why had I just walked in circles in the dark? I sat there holding on to the flashlight, waiting for something to happen, some sound to tell me what was out there. But the forest remained silent, the air thick and still. Finally, the first few rays from dawn, they filtered through the trees, making the world gray and ghostly. I dared to leave the store. The footprints were still there, heading towards the forest, there. Edges blurred by the morning fog, I followed them a few meters, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but they seemed to fade as quickly as they had appeared, disappearing into the undergrowth as if they had never been there. Packed at record speed, putting my things in the backpack with shaky hands. I didn't care that I hadn't eaten breakfast, that I had planned to stay another night. I just wanted to get out of that woods, put as much distance as possible between me and whatever had been there. As I walked back towards the road, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing among the trees watching me, but the forest remained empty, the morning light filtering through the canopy, projecting long shadows to stretch forever. When I finally got to my truck, I tossed my backpack in the back and got out of there, tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was several miles away. The forest turned into a blur in the rearview mirror. It's been months since that trip, but the memory of those footprints still haunts me. I've tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, that my mind played tricks on me in the dark, but deep down I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere in that forest something was watching me that night, something that left no footprints like any animal I've ever seen before. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest since then, and I've given up camping alone, even in places that seem safe, because now I know that the silence of the forest is not always empty, and if you are not careful, you could discover what is hidden in the stillness.